Today, I have with me Nilofer Merchant, author of 11 Rules for Creating Value in the Social Era. I'm going to hold the cell phone up to the screen here because this is a Kindle edition book.
Mhm.
A great book put out by Harvard Business Press. Fast Company called it one of the best business books of 2012. Nilofer, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming and speaking with me about your latest work. Since I've discovered this book, I've discovered a lot of your other work, and I'm really captivated by a lot of what you bring to the world. And what we were talking about in preparing for today's call was to look at some of these ideas you have from the perspective of a CIO
Mm.
or an IT leadership perspective. So you've got some big ideas. I think it's interesting when I just look at the title of the book, The 11 Rules for Creating Value in the Social Era. This is not a marketing book. This isn't one of those latest things about the trends. This is really big thinking about big changes that are afoot. This is not about, I think for CIOs, IT leaders, we've been aware of and sort of, figuring out how to deal with things like social media, Enterprise 2.0, collaboration within the organization. There's some trying to navigate, who owns this in the organization, what does it mean to the organization, how do we move forward. You've put forth in this book a premise that's much bigger than that, and I was hoping you could spend a minute or two just sort of giving us the thesis.
Sure. So the fundamental piece well, I'll start with the history of why I started writing this piece, and then I'll back into what I think the premise is. So I started writing this piece while I was effectively in a board context. So I sit on both public and private boards, and one of the things I was realizing was that people have been taught this notion about size matters, that there is such a thing as a competitive advantage, that you should sort of build up barriers, that you should focus on your core business, and a series of constructs that basically are about holding on to what you have. And from what everything I can tell is that innovation today is not driven by preserving, but by actually figuring out how to go leap from opportunity to opportunity. And so I'm in this board meeting and people are sort of doing this protective conversation. And I started drawing a tombstone and started listing out the ideas that this group of people were talking about. And I realized they were fundamentally the thesis ideas of Michael Porter and the related ideas adjacent to that. And I came back to my office, here, and I started Googling who else has written sort of the rebuttal argument. And I couldn't find anything. And I actually, the really funky part about that is I actually thought, I must not be searching right. So I actually reached out to people I regard and said, somebody's got to have written this, sort of the next generation piece. And people were like, no, nobody's written that. And I thought, oh. And so I sat and wrote what started out as a 4,000 word piece, ultimately became a blog, and ultimately became this ebook, which is fundamentally saying that traditional strategy as it's been formed uh, leaves us in a position where we're trying to act like the 800-pound gorilla and trying to protect our turf, trying to think that size matters, trying to dominate over others. And I thought that the era in which we're living with is more like how we behave when we are 800 gazelles. We come together in a very loose coalition. We come together as we need to. We're incredibly nimble and we're able to focus on not just what have we done in protecting that space, but how do we leap from here to there, and with a kind of agility and fluidity. And so that ended up forming the fundamental architecture of the book. And then I kind of take that to a couple levels about how do we think about organizational design, how do we think about leadership, how do we think about ourselves, who are we individually in relationship to this organization.
Yeah, that's great, and that leads me right into a few points I want to get into because CIOs and IT leaders are right in the middle of setting strategy and executing plans of the organization. And as soon as I read the phrase, it resonated with me. This air sandwich concept you talked about. There is a gap in a lot of places between the big thinkers way on high thinking up the strategy and the folks who execute it. And I think that it resonated because there's a lot of confusion and sort of stress around some of these things right at that inflection point. So I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on your air sandwich
Yes, so
idea.
the air sandwich concept is of course, the thesis of my first book, which is about collaborative work within the enterprise. And this book, of course, is about collaboration outside the enterprise. But the air sandwich is just like any good sandwich, peanut butter and jelly sandwich. The stuff in the middle really matters. And in organizations, what's happening way too much is people from on high setting direction and then telling people within the organization to go do stuff, but all the stuff in the middle is missing, meaning the debates, the discussions, the trade-offs, the understanding that's happening is not happening, right? And that just creates a vacuum. And so I call that the air sandwich, and I am trying to point to nothing actually happens when you have the stuff missing in the middle. And in fact, that book, one of the reasons I wrote it is there's a very strong hypothesis in business that says strategy is owned by one part of the organization and execution is owned by another. And that thesis essentially was formulated when people were stupid. And by that, they weren't as educated, information was not as readily accessible, and the markets didn't move very fast. So the constructs of the 70s and 80s was all pre-internet, was all if you think about how much education is now prevalent today compared to 30 or 40 years ago, those two things have fundamentally shifted how you allow people in your organization to engage. And in fact, there's a guy on the web, I'm trying to think of his name for a second, and I'll get it. But he's been doing a series of videos around the social era. And one of them is actually, and he was the one who called it back out to me. He goes, people are not stupid anymore. And so he does this like 10-minute video about people are not stupid anymore. I'm like, exactly. No one's stupid anymore. And so once you fundamentally assume that everyone's smart, it changes how you think about engaging with people, right?
Yeah, it's less about command and control then at that point.
And and it's also figuring out they know a bunch of things you don't know.
Absolutely.
Right. And there's a book that was written, it's a really kind of representative of old school thinking, and it's called Execution. And the first time I ever got exposed to it, I was doing a bunch of strategy work for Adobe. And the CEO at the time was, I don't know what the right word is, assigning, I don't know, but he asked everyone in the company to read this book called Execution. So I thought, well, since I'm doing so much work with this C-suite and board, I thought I should read it too, because clearly it's like the thinking of the day. So I went and got it, and on page, I don't know, 4 or 6, it actually says something to the effect of, the reason that the company's failing is not because you're not brilliant, dear executive, but because your people are just not executing well. And I was just like, are you fucking, excuse my language for a second, are you fucking kidding me? Like, are you, the CEO of the company just handed this, and on page 6, it says your people are stupid. And I but it's a prevalent formulation of how people think about their staff.
Yeah, it's interesting because it reminds me of one of my favorite sayings out there, which is execution eats strategy for lunch. You know, the greatest idea and the greatest strategy.
Quote, by the way. It's a Drucker quote that says, execution is everything.
Yeah, yeah. So, and so taking this beyond the walls of the enterprise, you were talking about the air sandwich being within the enterprise. Taking this beyond, I love one of the other phrases from your book was, the customer is the guy at the end of the value chain, is sort of the old model. So not only do you have the thinking on high, the air sandwich and the stress around that, and whatever happens with execution, and the customer is almost sort of a victim of the enterprise, rather than, I think you're suggesting a totally new model here about co-creation. Maybe you could touch on that for a minute.
Sure. So going back to the value chain. So again, a Porter visual that was done back in the 70s, 80s timeframe was this notion of what's the set of sequences an organization needs to follow in order for value to be created. And it was thinking about what's the supply chain management process, is HR and IT supporting function kind of process, and they had this notion of a customer, and they in fact called it a buyer right at the end of this thing. And I just started looking around at all the organizations I'm watching, and none of them have this buyer way out there. And it's more like value flow. Apple, in its relationship with developers in the mobile platform, is certainly not having someone out there. It's really thinking about how to co-opt a group of people to provide value with them, right? So that's one example of a platform. Intuit has a thing where for all their accountants, they can actually allow accountants to answer each other's questions. And I think they figured out that in one product line, it's lowered 30-some% of the cost, SG&A, but it's also answered 70-some% of all the questions are answered peer-to-peer. So here's a group of people who are actually using the platform to connect with each other. So certainly not somebody at the end of a process. And then, of course, IBM with their Smarter Planet solution they actually invented the Smarter Planet solution with customers, with actual people saying, hey, you could actually do this, and you could do this, and you could do this. And now nearly 20% of the revenue stream of IBM is coming from those invented together, co-created product lines. That customer is not out there. The customer is sitting like in here with us, figuring out how do we create value. And until we recognize that that is a very transparent, porous, interactive relationship, then we continue to think about it as us and them. Let us wait until we all figure it out, and then we'll tell them, right? Or let us figure out what it is we need to do, and then we'll do it to them. And the opposite is true, which is now, okay, so they're sitting like almost like with us. Why don't we ask them a bunch of questions? Why don't we figure out how to figure out what really works? And then it changes not only how you think about what is it you produce, it changes how you engage other people, and it shortens that cycle time from ideation to execution in that process too.
Yeah, then your customers can feel part of it, and they feel some ownership. And you talk in parts of the book about working towards a more of a shared purpose.
Yeah, and you don't have to sell the thing that you've created together.
Yeah.
Right. So here's the thing: is if we've built it together, then redefine value proposition to me, because it's not just the thing that I define; it's a thing we've defined,
Right.
and you can start associating a premium value to that too.
Right. And another area where you follow this line similarly that I think would be interesting for CIOs, IT executives to consider is in customer service. You talk about McAfee, the antivirus company, and what they've done there. And, customer service, both for the IT organization itself and what IT does to service the organization and servicing their customers. I thought you had some great ideas there about how you see the future of customer service and McAfee specifically as an example.
So McAfee actually figured out that they could certainly provide service, but they actually had a bunch of IT professionals in their, if you're using a big word, buzzword, ecosystem of expertise. And they just thought, why don't we actually let them help one another? And so here are these IT professionals who really are very competent figuring out how to answer customers' problems. And in doing so, it turned out that McAfee could actually get out of the way. And they found a way to basically authorize and charter and support what they call the McAfee Mavens. And then they just simply kept backing further and further away, realizing that they weren't adding any value in the process, right? And so here were all these incredibly talented IT professionals able to solve consumer problems. Consumers could actually give little ratings back to say, hey, this guy is really knowledgeable, or this gal is really knowledgeable. And in fact, there was one person who had answered something like 77,000 questions. And I just thought, like, they deserve a little medal. But beyond the immediate, what it meant for that company is they were able to stop thinking about service as an expense. And they were able to start shifting those dollars someplace else, right? So it impacts the bottom line. But those customers actually felt supported in a really different way than they would have if they're in this transactional relationship with a company. And that's really, I think, the fundamental opportunity is it's as soon as you tear down this artificial premise of who's in the firm and who's out of the firm, then there's a sort of intimacy that starts to happen and a kind of different kind of relationship that starts to happen. It's not transactional, it's relational. And that can change the kind of commitment that we have towards one another.
Yeah, and you talked about, so I love the big idea, big shift. It's easy to see when you talk about it. It's nice to have the McAfee example, but you talked a little bit about how they sort of backed away slowly and thoughtfully over time. So this isn't something where we flip a light switch. What do you see that, where's the right place to start? How do we start testing the waters and getting folks comfortable with this?
Well, so one of the things I want to just point out is that the social constructs that I'm describing can affect every part of the business. You just pointed out the service examples. One of the things I did in the book is I just figured out every functional area of the business and found a relevant example. Because I'm actually trying to suggest that even though I haven't seen one organization do it through and through, that it's indicative enough that it can happen in every part of the business. So that's the first piece. The second piece is to recognize that community constructs can happen in any part of the business. So whether or not it's creating a product with one another or having people provide service with you, or in the case of the Apple developers, figuring out a way to have value created on top of your platform. So really thinking about who are the different communities could be like one very, very tangible step. Who are the communities that we could engage, and where in the organization could we engage them? Where could that start to happen? And then the third piece is to think about what are the phases of movement. So the first phase can be to think about how do we even give technology and platform tools so that it's not about this big walled garden between us and them? So what are the ways in which we can start to think about technology allowing anyone to work from anywhere? How do you even think about opening up stuff? So brain jams and some of the open innovation work that's been in the marketplace. What are those technologies and tools that allow us to have a conversation? And then going to a third phase, which is to say, how do we actually build this together? And I think a really interesting example I'm sort of mesmerized lately with is Quirky. Quirky is based out of New York, and here's the thing: they have figured out they're like the next generation GE.
Hmm.
So play this one out. So they have someone invent an idea, but that inventor doesn't have to actually build the idea. So they first come up with an idea and they kind of put it into this process. Quirky actually does 3D modeling and manufacturing, and they actually have all the machines to do all that. They'll actually sort of scout the product. They'll have people in the community say, yes, I want to buy that product. They'll have an entire vetting process about how do we make it really viable. They actually have ways of financing it so that Kickstarter and stuff can collaborate with it. They have deals with Bed Bath and Beyond and other places to sell it. No, there's like very little of an enterprise, one big thing, but they have this really integrated way of having customer. Um, there's not even customer, right? It's not really thinking about us and them. It's just sort of like there's a guy inventing something, and do people want to buy it? Okay, who wants to buy it? Who wants to finance it? Who wants to sell it? And you start really having this very open dialogue. And it's not about, gosh, I have 12 people or 1,200 or 12,000 people working uh, in my organization. It's really thinking about what is it we're making and what's this versatile kind of ways in which we can assemble talent. And Quirky, of course, has some great tools and technologies that are thinking about, okay, when we're doing an open innovation process and having people vote, what's the tools we need? When we're doing a who wants to finance it, then what are the tools we need? When we're doing a sales order process, so we have transparency between Bed Bath and Beyond and what the inventor first started out with, how do we pay that person? So it's a different set of technologies. So how do we think about what are the tools and technologies that allow us to have communication flow in all these various ways, independently of who's in the enterprise, but more who's working on a shared problem?
And I think a lot of that can be leveraged within an IT organization. So again, I'm reading your book from a couple of different levels. One is helping the organization as a whole think about these things, but also thinking about how the IT organization can itself be made more effective. So you talked in the book about openness, which you just talked about, and opening up that process a little bit and finding areas to do that within your organization, corralling folks around a shared purpose, which, for CIOs, IT leaders, you have to lead and influence people who are not direct reports, who don't know what you do, who don't know, a lot yet. You're in the unique position of really kind of knowing the nooks and crannies of how the whole place works.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of value to add, but you've got to lead, not so much with the fact, but by the shared purpose. I like the openness idea that you just described about Quirky and sort of thinking about your organization in that realm. But one specific idea I wanted to jump to in the book was this idea of onlyness and thinking about how you organize and leverage your team and bring out the best in everybody and make that work for the shared purpose. So it's a little bit of a messier construct, right? This is where I think it's going to get folks a little bit uncomfortable. But it makes a lot of sense the way you structure it in the book. But I love the onlyness idea. If you could talk about that for a second.
Sure. So, the fundamental premise of social era is that you don't need an organization anymore to create value. That's the big moment, which is different than you started out this conversation with. It's different than Enterprise 2.0. Enterprise 2.0 actually didn't say, gosh, we're going to change anything. All it said is we're going to use tools to better communicate. And I'm like, it's not quite it. And I don't think it's about social media in the sense of it's totally not about tools, right? So I actually posed the question about if you were going to start over again and you recognize that individuals connected together can actually create value, then you actually have a very fundamental premise about what is the organization in the first place, and then what is the overlay of technology on top of that, right? So they become very strategic. I think actually technology becomes incredibly important in this whole mix of things, but not because you're trying to, not because you know exactly where information is going to go from one place to the other. And so it's more about how do you start to create hubs of conversation flow. So this thing about onlyness is, okay, so if you believe that individuals connected together can create value, then it's not about whether or not we're there in service of an HP or in service of a particular enterprise. It's about what is it I can solve problems on? What is it you can solve problems from? And I'm pointing out this source, this inherent talent and perspectives and vision that each of us bring, not because we're cogs in some machine doing a set job, but because we have a very different formulation of things that are going on in our head. Probably the greatest iconic example in our modern day is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs really celebrated his onlyness, and 30 years ago, people looked at him like he was the oddest duck because he cared about fonts and he cared about just the experience of something. And yet, 30 years later, we can all look at that and go, it can change what we use every day, right? Because he honored that onlyness every day until he finally found a way to manifest it in ways that could allow him to create value. What happens when each of us can do that and really honor that thing that we are called to do? And of course, I think that takes a little bit of discernment and wisdom in our own life to figure it out, to see our own through line of our own story and contribute it. But every major problem I've ever seen solved, when I go look at the inventors in science or the entrepreneurs, they're doing it because they're sitting there going, this problem is my problem. Like, I see my brother dying, I see this issue right in front of me, and they start creatively applying that perspective, not because somebody told them to, but because they saw and they listened to that call. Organizations every single day have talent within our business that we don't ask them to show up that way. But what if we could?
Yeah, it's an idea I believe in, and I try and embed in my management style. It takes a bit of coaxing to bring that out of folks. So you're talking about it from two levels. One is, if I think of myself as the leader and my onlyness, what can I bring to the table? But also for the folks that work in my organization, how do I encourage and support and let them know that it's okay, and let them discover what it is, and really shape the team in a reaction to what is the collective onlyness here, and
Yeah,
what are we able to do not only as individuals but as a group that we couldn't do with any other contract.
because who we are is what we make. And if we just say, gosh, you're here to do X job, we're not actually saying to that person, bring all of you. We're saying, bring this tiny little part of you that can do this job. And that's limiting innovation and creativity and problem solving and all those other things, right?
Yeah. So I want to wrap up with a couple of more ideas here. One is, as a board member, senior executive, what's your view of IT? What are you seeing that's good out there? What are you seeing that makes you cringe a little bit? What's your advice to CIOs and IT leaders from the board level?
Well, the first thing is I think we really ought to figure out how to have IT be a more strategic player. We're still thinking about it as the tools and the afterthought rather than this central part about how do you actually use technology to create more communication. It can be as simple as something like Yammer deployment, which allows people to actually have an exchange, or it can be things like platforms like Apple's put in place or Intuit's put in place. And really thinking about where are the strategic points of leverage, right? Using a very jargony term. But IT actually knows those and knows how to bring people together. And so we ought to figure out how to engage them in that conversation. Um, and when I look at organizations that are really struggling, it's because they're still thinking too siloed. So if I had to encourage anything out of this professional group that you're talking to, is to stop thinking about yourself as this silo of IT and start thinking about yourself as a co-owner of this thing we're building together. And it happens to be your expertise is going to be tools and technology. But don't make it about tools and technology because it's so not about that, right?
Right, right. That's great, and that's why I liked your book so much, because it puts this big idea out there very eloquently. So, a couple of things. So it's a Kindle edition ebook. So I can't tell how many pages it is, but when I read it on my phone, and it just it struck me as like the right size.
Mm,
You've got a big idea. It's well put together. It's constructed well. It's supported with some details, and then you say at the end, "Hey, this is the big idea. It's still formulating. Take it and run with it." But I really like what you did with the book in terms of I don't know. It just feels like a concise big idea, something you can digest that doesn't have a lot of fluff to it. Is that because it's in an ebook format, or how did that?
I mean, I wrote it with the idea I wanted people to be able to read it within an hour.
Yeah,
And some people say, well, it took me an hour and a half, and I read it twice. And I'm like, okay, I didn't mean for it to be that. I wanted to be really approachable because I think this is an idea that needs to be shared. Um, when Harvard first asked me to do the book, they said, well, if you do we think it's a worthy book, we want it to be a paper book, because that's kind of a higher echelon in Harvard's life of how they think about things. And I asked them, well, how long would it take from the time I handed off the manuscript to the time we did a physical book? And it was going to be 18 months. And I'm like, no, that's actually not the thesis of the book. The thesis of the book, in case you hadn't read it, people, is we've got to be fast, fluid, and flexible. So I just couldn't honor the idea by them doing a physical book, right? That seemed out of place. So I let it be an ebook to see where it went. Of course, it's become a bestseller and been very well received. And I'm thinking a lot about what's the next generation of it.
Yeah.
And of course, I have an opportunity to do a physical book if I want to. I'm thinking about doing it, but I'm actually thinking about my current thinking. This is all literally like as I'm thinking about it, because it's a question in my mind, is to flip the book over. Since I already have one piece of it written about business models and organizational construct, I thought about literally flipping it over and doing an entire leadership take on it and creating a different narrative flow. Because there are some people who just already get the business model piece and want to digest the leadership piece, and that might give the separation of the ideas.
Yeah, I think the leadership piece would be great, and that's really kind of the audience for this interview we're doing today, CIOs, IT leaders, and I think there's a number of elements you can take out of it, the big idea itself, but a number of leadership elements. But I hope that you do create a print version, because I want to buy copies and hand them out to people, and I like ebooks. I like physical books. I have a Nook. I consume audio books in all formats. But I kind of like to have multiple formats of the books. It makes them easier to share and pass around. Okay, one last thing.
Just so you know, if you go to Harvard, anything above 100 units, they can actually, and the book is ridiculously cheap, right? So
Right.
$4, not going to kill anyone. And but they can actually print 100, and they can do it custom for an organization, so it can allow a conversation to happen within a team. So I've been seeing book teams, reading teams come together, buy it, have a conversation, and then they figure out what kind of community should we engage, what's our real purpose. They're starting to have the work group kind of conversations about what does this mean for us, which is what my original intention was of the book.
That's great. I didn't know that, and that's interesting. I'm fascinated by how books are evolving and how they're used in all of those things. So that's
Yeah.
good to know. One last thing before I let you go is we've covered a lot of ground that we set out to cover, but I told you I've been following your blog now, and you put out a post the other day that was really fascinating about these walking meetings, and I think this is an idea that people can sort of take and embrace immediately. So if you share that
Sure.
idea for a
It
second.
just started for me a couple years ago, where I was having a really hard time making fitness a priority. And as a lot of us do, we're incredibly busy. And um, I just did this one simple change where I changed one meeting a day from a coffee meeting or a lunch meeting to a walk and talk meeting. So it could mean changing shoes and just walking, or it could mean wearing sort of a hiking boots and going up in the hills. So depending on where I was and what I had access to. And so I wrote this up because sitting is actually the one thing we're doing more than our technology, more than the devices, more than anything else we're doing in our modern day work. The sort of technology we're using the most is our bottom. And the stat I found was that we were sitting for 9.3 hours a day. And just kind of put that in perspective, we're only sleeping for 7-something hours a day. So just, it's a vast amount of time that we're in fact sitting. And there's a bunch of data that says that that's actually literally killing us, that it can contribute to and directly contributes to 10% of colon cancer, 10% of breast cancer, just like these numbers. And so I wrote this post thinking how silly it is that I actually sort of stumbled upon it. And it's really become sort of life-changing for me. And I shared it with that thing. It's become the most viewed, top 5th most viewed piece of content across the web, and best on Harvard and all these other sites. And it strikes me that sometimes it's about when we figure out how to do an solution that we, even in business, right? We think about purpose or we think about profits, and we think about those sometimes as competing goals. We can take care of our people through purpose, or we should focus on the bottom line. And it takes a pretty advanced leader to understand that those two actually sit together. And I think, and now I look back and I think, gosh, I had this epiphany about I could do these walk and talks and do both at the same time. I wonder how many other solutions we could actually solve for if we just started thinking more about how can we do both.
Yeah, it's something in a non-sequential. It strikes me as we're wrapping up here, a lot of things we've talked about have been very sequential. Develop the strategy and then execute. Everything's been, the value chain and the flow goes from one to the other. So I love the idea of thinking differently about combining some of these things and just sort of stepping back and going, maybe everything doesn't have to compete.
Yeah. Yeah, there we go.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time today. We covered a lot of ground. I'm sure there's tons more we could go over. So hopefully we can do this again. And everybody who's watching, listening, reading should go out and buy Nilofer's book, 11 Rules for Creating Value in the Social Era. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.